Yeah, and welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Still Curtain podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi, and joining me, as always, is contributor Shayne Kubas. I was off last week on vacation, a nice time to kind of sit back and recharge the batteries, if you will. But not so good of news to come back to as we begin the show today. Clark Haggans has passed away, former Steelers outside linebacker, a guy that I really grew up watching play a ton. And so, just tragic news here, Shane. I don't know. This might have been a little bit before your time. Do you remember Haggans at all?
I do. Yeah, I remember him because I started really watching the Steelers around 2002, 3-ish, I believe is
That was
when I was very young.
right in your range
Yeah,
then.
so
Yeah.
yeah, very definitely familiar. I know, watching the Super Bowl, he had the sack in the Super Bowl and
Hmm.
had a couple good years, especially statistically. But just a solid all around player, fifth round pick, typical Steelers type guy that gets drafted late, develops after a while, makes a good career out of himself, and just unfortunate. We don't know the cause of death or that
Hmm.
hasn't been disclosed, but regardless of why, you hate to see a guy that's not even 50 yet, and meant a lot to the Steelers, pass away so soon. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Only 46 years old, leaves behind a son and a daughter, and you hate to see that. And Higgins was one
Yeah.
of those guys who he was never really the guy in the spotlight, kind of a little bit overshadowed by like Troy Polamalu, James Harrison. But man,
Yeah.
was he an integral part of a fantastic defense there
Yes.
in Pittsburgh. In the year they won the Super Bowl XL. Back in 2005, following the 2005 season, he had 9 sacks that year, and like you said, he had the sack in the Super Bowl itself. So he had a big season, big contributor in that part, and so he will be missed. Anthony Miller was released this week as well, Shane, and so this was one that kind of caught fans a little bit off guard, I think, because a lot of people were expecting Miller not only to make the team, but to carve out some sort of role, whether that been as a punt returner, as a slot receiver. And I think that he's a guy that kind of just got a little bit lost in the shuffle. And man, he has been so unfortunate in terms of his health, dealing with another soft tissue injury. Obviously, missed all of last season on IR with a shoulder injury. And so you're looking at a guy who already, even though he seems like he should be a young guy, he's only drafted as a second round pick back in 2018, same year as Terrell Edmonds. Anthony Miller's already 28 years old. I mean, he was 24 during his rookie season. And so this guy now, you're looking at a guy who's probably past his NFL prime, certainly past the window of opportunity, being already on the Bears, on the Texans, now on the Steelers. Now he's going to be looking for a fourth NFL team. I feel for the guy because I really liked him coming out of Memphis. I thought he was a really solid all-around player. Some of his traits remind me a little bit of Antonio Brown, like the way he was just able to move and to make stuff happen after the catch. Super productive guy in college. But his time with the Steelers has officially come to an end at this point. They've made that announcement official now. The Steelers have released him. And so it's looking like they're going to be deploying, obviously, other players in the slot position here. And we're going to break down the receivers and the roles of the receivers could have on the team this year. What are your thoughts, though, on the decision to release Anthony Miller?
I think it's telling that they clearly. I think for one thing, this means that Austin should be at least at worst the fourth wide receiver, right?
Mm-hmm.
He clearly is going to have a role in the offense, and that's kind of been talked about already during camp. Like, it seems very obvious that they have some sort of plan for him. But I think that, Anthony Miller kind of was, to a lesser degree, what they hope Austin is, and probably what they are hoping Austin will do this year. So they may have just felt like the competing skill set there, like they didn't need to have that type of player on the roster when they already have a guy that they think is going to be able to fill that role. It also, I think, tells you that some of the other guys on the roster, they value their special teams contributions more. And maybe with a guy like Hakeem Butler, maybe they think he might be a better piece on offense if he does stick around on the roster. So I think it's just a combination of just how many guys are currently in camp that they believe in to a certain degree, and the injury
Mm-hmm.
history doesn't exactly help him, like you said. It's unfortunate, but he is one of those end of roster type players to begin with, and then you factor in injuries. He's not going to have any favors with the team if he can't stay healthy.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't have Anthony Miller making my final 53-man roster when I did my predictions, but I also didn't see his release happening this
This
early. I thought
early
he was a
on,
guy
yeah.
that, yeah, I thought he would at least make it through camp, and part of that might have been due to him being banged up and just not being able to stay on the field and get the work in out there. And again, I think you're looking at there's just too many guys not have hats to go around in terms of his role on the team, because the Steelers traded for Allen Robinson. He's an outside receiver by trade, but it certainly looks like the Steelers are going to play him in the slot often.
Yeah.
And so if you already have him in the slot, you've got Calvin Austin, who I'm guessing at being a sub 5'8" receiver is also going to play a lot of slot. There probably just wasn't enough room for that guy, a little bit of redundancy there, if you will. And obviously you don't want to get rid of the bottom of your roster. Guys have to be able to carve out roles in special teams and special teams coverage. And so that's what Miles Boykin was brought in for. I expect Miles Boykin to make the team. He's not a lock to. I think his biggest competition would be like a Hakeem Butler if we could find out that he could play special teams. But Boykin has a huge leg up because of all the snaps that he logged in that department going back to his time with the Ravens. And so when you looked at Anthony Miller and you look at his role on the team, that's why I had him on the outside looking in as a kind of a long shot to make the roster, because you had an older guy. Is he going to beat out the fourth rounder from last year? No, he wasn't going to do that. Is he going to beat out the guy the Steelers traded for and guaranteed $5 million salary? He wasn't going to do that either. And so he needed to be like an ace return man in order to really have a role solidified on the roster this year. Obviously, we didn't even get to make it to that point, Shayne. We didn't get to see him at all in training camp, and that's a little bit unfortunate. But it is what it is. It probably speaks more so towards actually having depth on the roster this year. Like if this was last year, there's no way that the Steelers are cutting Anthony Miller if he's banged up during OTAs and minicamp. No, because I mean, I still think that regardless of the fact that he only has 25 receiving yards since 2020, he's a better receiver than Steven Sims. There's no doubt in my mind that in terms of just a receiver, and he's had success in the past. In his second year with the Bears, he had a quality season.
Yeah.
But he just can't seem to stay on the field. Best ability is availability. He doesn't have it. So Shayne, let's break down the roles of the Steelers wide receivers, or what we think the roles of the Steelers wide receivers will be in 2023. And let's start right off with this, because I know this has changed. Both you and I, after the schedule release, we've given our 53-man roster predictions. These are going to update, obviously, as we move on, and certainly once we get through training camp. But let's do this specifically for the wide receiver position right now. Who makes the team at wide receiver? A lot of controversy, a lot of thoughts out there that I've seen just in recent days in terms of, do the Steelers keep 5? Do they keep the 6th receiver this year? How many do you think they keep, and who are those guys?
So I think keeping 6 is going to ultimately be what they do. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One, I think it's because you have guys who, if they do make the roster, are injury risks, right? Allen Robinson has missed time in recent years. Calvin Austin missed all of last year. You want to make sure you have guys on the opening roster that you can go to, that you don't have to pull up from the practice squad or, off the street if you need to. So I think that they are going to go with 6 again. I think that there's 5 guys that I'm super comfortable with saying are going to make the team. You have your top 3, of course, with George Pickens, Deontay Johnson, and Allen Robinson. Those 3 are going to make the roster, barring something unforeseen or something like that. Then you look into Calvin Austin, obviously, coming back from last year. I do think they have a role planned for him, so he, of course, is going to make the team. And then I do think Miles Boykin is a lock because of his special teams value. I think that he does so much on special teams as a gunner. They need someone to fill that role on this roster, and he's kind of the only clear-cut one right now. And then you get to, do you keep a guy like Hakeem Butler if he can show enough special teams ability to stick around? Do you keep Gunnar Olszewski again? Do you look at someone, even outside of those guys? That Cody White, for example, has been around for a while now in some capacity. I think it seems like they still believe in Gunnar to a certain degree for a role. So that's probably where I'd be leaning right now. But I wouldn't be surprised if Hakeem Butler shows just some amount of special teams ability and can show that he can make plays in the passing game in preseason and camp. He could fill that 6th spot. I think that's definitely possible.
Yeah, I would lean towards 6 as well. First of all, if I give the number out there, because I've seen some others say 5. I don't know if the Steelers are going to want to go that thin. Yeah. It doesn't feel right to me because of the makeup of the roster. And I think this is one of your deepest positions. I think it's part of the reason why you can get rid of an Anthony Miller right now and not feel any ill effects from it, really, because even if you have that 6th guy, if Miller was here, he still is competing with Gunnar Olszewski, who is a better special teams player, a guy that can play special teams coverage units, and a guy like the XFL star and Hakeem Butler, who, if he has a good camp, maybe there's some incentive to keep him there. Obviously, if Butler makes it, he's going to be a guy that has to carve out a role on special teams somehow. You
Yeah, in
can't be
some capacity, yeah.
yeah, you can't be the last receiver on the roster and not play special
No.
teams. It just doesn't
No,
work
you
that way.
can't. Not quite.
So I agree, Shayne. I think it's going to be 6. And I think that I agree with the same 5 that you said too. I think that Miles Boykin is pretty safe because of how solid he has been in special teams coverage units. And I think that Olszewski is a guy that, again, could stick around. And I know that he's been disappointing as a return man, but the Steelers don't necessarily need him to do that. I know that you can save a little bit of money by releasing him, but he's probably more valuable just as a core special teams player than the money that you would save. Like, I'd rather have Olszewski on the team than bring back like a Benny Snell or something like that.
Right.
I think that you're better off going with what you have to fill that role as a special teams player. So those are the guys that we think are going to make it. If we just had to take a guess right now, how do you think the workload is going to be divided this year? So we look at these last 3 seasons, like Deontay has had a huge market share for the Steelers, over 144 targets in every season. That's a lot. I mean, he's consistently like top 6 or 8 in the NFL in terms of targets. Do you think that divide is still going to be the same way for the Steelers? Is he still going to be the guy that gets peppered with targets underneath because he can routinely get open? Are they going to divide it a little bit more evenly this year, Shayne, between a George Pickens and for the sake of this, I know that Freiermuth is almost guaranteed to be top 3 in targets this year in the passing game, but let's try to keep the focus specifically on the wide receiving core. How do you think this workload is going to be divvied up between these guys?
Well, so looking at last year, because that's obviously kind of where you want to start, is look at how they did things last year. Deontay got 147 targets, right, which was one of the best marks in the league in terms of pure targets, which again we expect. Pat, like you said, we're going to exclude him, but he was second on the team in 98. Pickens had 84 targets, and the combination of Chase Claypool and Steven Sims, who were the primary slot receivers during the season, got a total of about 73. So I hope that that's different, but if we're going off of that, my guess is Deontay's still going to be upwards of about 130 targets or more if he's healthy. I'd be surprised if he gets far below that amount. I'd like him to be closer to 100, 110, maybe even 120 at the most, just because that means that those targets are getting used elsewhere. But I'd be surprised if he doesn't approach at least 130. I'm hoping Pickens gets close to or above 100 targets this year because clearly he's been so efficient in he was so efficient his first year with his targets. You hope that they can manufacture a couple more deep plays to him and also some more plays to him that they didn't really get a chance to do last year. More, in breaking routes, stuff that he didn't really do a lot of last year. Get him more involved as a runner after the catch too, because I do think he has that in his skill set if he's given the opportunity. This offense, as we know, though, doesn't really give people that opportunity, unfortunately. So, hoping he gets close to 100 targets, and I think Robinson is going to be between 60 and 75 targets is my guess if he stays healthy in the slot. I don't think he's going to be a huge part of the passing game, but I think he can be effective as a slot receiver. And then the rest of the receiver targets, I'm guessing most of the rest of them, you're looking at Calvin getting somewhere between 40 and 50, you hope. And then the back end of the roster guys, if they get in the game on offense, if they're in the game, they might get a target or 2 here or there. But it's really those 4 that I'm looking at.
Yeah, we know that the game plan, though, is going to be try to run the football.
Yes.
If the Steelers are able to stick with that, then we might not be able to get numbers that high. And so just looking at last year, Shayne, Chase Claypool had 50 targets in 8 games before he left. Steven Sims only had 23 on the season, despite being with the team for 12 games. I mean, that's 73 targets right there from those 2 slot receivers. So I think the most interesting thing and the thing that I'll be the most interested to see this year is between Allen Robinson and Calvin Austin, who gets the most targets there. I think it's going to be Robinson, if I had to guess, being the veteran guy. But I want to see how that is divided in the certain packages where they use Austin over Robinson. Like in a perfect world, you want Robinson to beat out. You want Calvin Austin to beat out Allen Robinson. That probably means that it's good for his development, that he's come a long way and that he is explosive enough and has shown enough to be able to beat out the veteran there who's got a ton of experience. And so I'll be interested to see how the targets shake up there. I agree with you, though. Johnson's need to come down. They've got to come down this year because even if he's more efficient, even if he looks more like he did in 2021, I still don't think it's the best thing for your offense to just pepper one player, especially when you got a guy like George Pickens making plays at a very high rate. He had one of the highest explosive play rates in the NFL in terms of wide receivers last year. He was 13th in the NFL in yards per target. Obviously, we want to see Pat get the ball more as well. So I think that a better balance is the way Steelers should be approaching it. But again, I get it. You got a young quarterback and you're looking at a guy, not even a young quarterback. You can go back to Ben. Ben like throwing to him because he's a guy that can get open. So your eyes don't have to go all over the field. You know that you're counting on a guy to get open, and he does that well. So I'll be interested to see how those get divided there. In terms of efficiency, Shayne, who do you think is going to be the most efficient receiver on the Steelers this year? And last year it was George Pickens by a mile, 9.5 yards per target, nearly 110 passer rating when thrown to. Is that going to continue again this year if he does see an uptick in targets? Or do you think that's going to shift?
I think the only person on the roster in the receiver group that has a shot at dethroning him, and it's going to be on a lower amount of targets, is Calvin Austin. And that's because the explosiveness aspect. If he gets off a couple big plays and he only ends up with 30 or 40 catches, he might end up being a little bit more efficient on a per catch basis or per target basis. But this is George Pickens to lose, right? Like this is a guy that not only because of how he plays, but because of the fact that Deontay Johnson is a guy that just kind of soaks up targets and receptions. He's probably not going to get very far above 10, 11, 12 yards per catch, just based on the nature of how he's used. We're excluding tight ends in this case. So Pat, could theoretically do that, but tight ends generally aren't going to be super high in terms of per target or per catch rankings there. Allen Robinson is going to be lucky also, I think, to get far above 10 yards per catch just because of who he is as a player at this point, unless he gets a couple chunk like deep balls or something like that out of the slot, which I don't expect. It's really, I think, a race between Austin again, based on his usage, and then Pickens again. So if that doesn't happen, that either means that Pickens was super inefficient, which is a bad sign, or hopefully it means that Deontay had a uncharacteristic season or something like that, which would be great. But not betting on that at this point is correct. I think we kind of know who he is as a player.
Yeah, I think that Pickens is probably going to run away with that title again. Shayne, here's the numbers from last year in terms of yards per target. Pickens was at 9.5, which is really good. Like I said, 13th in the league. After that was Connor Hayward, a small sample size, but 8.9, very impressive. Benny Snell, obviously very small sample size. Gunnar Olszewski, small sample size. Then it was Pat Freiermuth at 7.5. And there's no other receivers really that even had a respectable yards per target numbers. Deontay was at 6.0, which is awful.
Just bad.
And Stevenson was at 4.5. Yeah. I mean, that is worse than dumping the ball off behind the line of scrimmage to a backup running. But that's bad. That's really bad. So we got to see those numbers improve across the board. Obviously, I'd be okay if Pickens came down a little bit if it meant that Johnson's was taking a big leap forward, because for the amount of times the Steelers probably intend to target him this year, that'd probably be more beneficial to the team. Obviously, don't want Pickens to take a step back. I'm hoping, Shayne, I'm hopeful that Pickens can show kind of traits of a wide receiver one. Like I kind of been feeling from the beginning, one of my high end comps for him is like the T. Higgins type of receiver. Like you may never be an elite separator, or you might not play like an elite athlete, even though he tested as a 93rd percentile athlete, but you're just the way you contort your body at the catch point, that your natural football ability, your ability to high point the football. If you can be a player like T. Higgins, like I genuinely believe that Bengals have two number one wide receivers. They just happen to have a top 3 receiver in the league in Jamar Chase, and then still another wide receiver one in T. Higgins. And so it's super valuable to an offense. It would do wonders for Kenny Pickett if Pickens was able to take another step forward. I think a lot of that depends on, though, his ability to improve as a route runner, ability to improve after the catch, 2 areas where he really wasn't very good. And the route tree is so small. So I do give him a little bit of grace there. If you improve that route tree, the other stuff is going to come with it. The separation numbers are going to go up. The yards after the catch numbers are going to go up. So let the guy work over the middle of the field more than he did as a rookie, because his route tree was just so small, goes and comebacks, and not a whole lot more than that. If you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and you would like to support the Steel Curtain Podcast, please consider subscribing to the Steel Curtain Podcast on YouTube. We appreciate all of your support. All right, Shayne, we're going to shift from wide receivers now, and we're going to talk about ranking the top 5 most valuable Steelers for the upcoming 2023 season. We've kind of reached that dead point in the offseason. The draft has died down a little bit. We still have a month to go until training camp. And so let's go into this topic, one that I think is really interesting, and there's going to be a lot of different viewpoints. If you guys are here joining us, please leave your comments in the chats. If you have any questions for us, please drop them in there. And as we go through this list, if you agree, disagree, please let us know. These are my rankings here. And Shayne, we're going to go by them starting at number 5. We're going to go all the way to number 1. Most important players on the Steelers. Now, this does not necessarily mean that these are the best players in respect to their position, just which ones will have the biggest impact and are most important to the success of the team this year. So let's kick things off at number 5, Shayne. I've got safety Minkah Fitzpatrick, 3-time All-Pro safety on a Hall of Fame pace, really. I think that he could really put himself,
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. In terms of his personal accolades, he could really put himself firmly in that pace with another All-Pro season this year. That would make 4. And we found, Shayne, doing some research, that really is a threshold. Like, you get to the 4th first-team All-Pro, you're sitting pretty in terms of your potential to make the Hall of Fame someday. And Minkah could certainly do that. I mean, he's only halfway through his career right now. And so that's something that can happen. Now, why do I only have him number 5, Shayne? Well, I think the value of the safety position in general is not all there. Now, if you get a guy like Minkah, that's a very valuable player, and it's why he's cracking the top 5. Most safeties in the NFL, you're not going to have them near a top 5 player on your team just because it's not a very valuable position on a whole. It's in general. Minkah, however, I think that when he is there and he is healthy, he is a guy that just makes plays. We saw that last year, tied for the league in interceptions. It's not the first time he's taken the ball away either. And so I think that this is a guy that, and even when Watt was out, I mean, he was kind of the leader of that defense there in making plays still. I've got him 5th on my rankings. Do you think that he should be higher, lower? What do you think?
I think this is fair. And like you said, the safety position is very hard to evaluate because a lot of the time it's not as important as, obviously outside corner or some other positions on defense. But when you have a player of Minkah's caliber, right? And we go back to when we had Troy Polamalu and back in time when we've had other safeties as well, that they change how you're able to play defense. Whenever you have a guy like that, it does elevate their level of importance to your team, because for a team that plays a lot of man coverage, a lot of cover 2, a lot of cover 3, where Minkah might be the guy in the back end that has to cover everything for you, his ability to do that and to take the football away, which is the key thing, that's the thing that our defense was missing during that lull in the mid 2010s when we had talented players, but we weren't taking the ball away. We weren't able to get off the field as easily because of that. Once Minkah showed up and that started to happen, where the ball production from him and other guys started to get better, that's when this team started to go back to its roots as a defensive first football team. And his ability to continue to do that is going to be what, especially for a mostly young secondary outside of, Patrick Peterson being brought in, but, we're not sure what we're going to get out of him at his age. Who knows if he were to fall off? You're asking a lot of either young players or guys that aren't the most talented to pick up a lot of the slack. So Minkah has to, because of that, keep that level of play up. And if he were to not do that, which we're not expecting him to, that could certainly spell a really rough season for the defense in general.
And I don't think it's any coincidence at all that the Steelers jumped up to be the number 1 DVOA defense, number 1 mostly across the board. As soon as they made that trade for him in 2019, they were number 3 defense the following year. Had a little bit of a setback in 2021. Wasn't quite the same dominant player. And this is the problem with the safety position, Shayne, is it's so contingent upon how many big and splash plays you make. And so if Minkah has a year where he's not quite making as many, his impact's not going to be felt quite as strong. And so this is the issue that we have with safeties. I don't know if Steelers fans realize how fortunate they are, though, to go from Polamalu, have a bit of a gap, and then have Minkah, because that's very rare. And most teams have safeties that are draft and replace, go out and get a mid-level free agent. And there's just not, to me, Shayne, they're kind of like the running backs of the defense. There's just not a huge difference between them all, unless you get that elite guy. So, and Minkah is basically like having the Nick Chubb of the running back position. And so he's valuable to the team. So there are 4 names still that I have as more valuable to the Steelers' success for the upcoming season. And so I'm going to get to a real controversial one right here. And that's number 4 is Diontae Johnson. Do I believe that Diontae Johnson is a better player than Minkah Fitzpatrick? By no means, Shayne. Absolutely not.
Right.
But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that wide receivers are just more important players in general, especially one where that draws so much of the market share like Deontay Johnson does with getting 140 to 160 targets every year. And so Pro Football Focus has a stat called WAR, wins above replacement. Wide receivers are second only to quarterbacks, Shayne. They even have them more valuable than edge rushers and offensive tackles. That's how valuable Pro Football Focus believes they are. Whether you agree with that or not, I think that the consensus would agree that the average wide receiver is still more valuable to a game than the average safety. Now, where you're splitting hairs, though, is you get an elite safety like Minkah and a quality wide receiver on a good day like Deontay. Which one's going to be more valuable? It still might be the guy, Shayne, that is getting 12 to 14 targets a game because he has such an impact on how many points that team's going to score, how many times they're going to get in the red zone. Johnson obviously needs to be much, much more efficient than he was last year. But if he looks like 2021 Johnson, and especially the guy that played the first 10 games of that season, there's reason to believe that he could certainly be more valuable to the team's success than Minkah this year because of the position that he plays. Do you agree or disagree with that?
So the general premise of him being important because of his position, I definitely understand and I agree with, because again, safety is as good as Minkah is. He has to force the issue to be able to create plays. Deontay is going to be force-fed opportunities to create plays. So it is much more important that he shows up every week because he's going to be forced to be in a position where if he doesn't show up, everyone's going to know. Minkah can have a game where maybe the ball just doesn't come to him, or maybe teams do a good job of avoiding him. And it might not mean that the defense plays bad, but he just might not be the specific reason that anything happened in the game outside of just being somebody that they have to avoid, and maybe it funnels the offense in a good direction for the defense. But in terms of impact, like Deontay is going to be given opportunities regardless every week that he's healthy to move the football. I will say the only thing I'll say here is I think that the more important receiver on this team, because of what I expect from Deontay, is George Pickens. Because Deontay, we kind of know at this point, even on his good days, we know who he is as a player. And because of the way the offense is being called, unless that changes, he's probably just not going to be significantly better or more efficient than he was last year, because even though he isn't the best after the catch because of his weird thing that he likes to run backwards and do all that stuff, like even if he just straight up ran like perfectly every time, the run after the catch isn't there in this offense. And unless that changes, his impact is dulled. It just is, because he can route somebody up and he can get open. But if it's an out route that's 8 yards into the sideline and he goes out of bounds, and it doesn't matter at the end of the day. Like, that's a good play, but he's not making these huge impactful plays. So unless they do get him down the field more, unless they can get him open on some of these posts and some of these shots down the field, and he can stay in bounds, because that's something that he's always been great at. That last year he didn't come down with a lot of those sideline catches that we've seen him make. If those things do improve, then he will be an important thing, and it will matter a lot how he plays. But I think it's going to end up falling more on George Pickens, really elevating his game and becoming more, like you said, like that, wide receiver one, and that, that T. Higgins mold, where you can give him 8, 9, 10 targets a game, and he can make good on those, not just on the deep balls. So I agree with the premise. I do wonder, though, that even if Deontay plays better, how much more will it matter because of the offense that he plays in?
Exactly. And that's, again, two different schools of thought there, but I 100% get what you are saying, Shayne. And my mind almost went there as well. And so the only reason that I decided to go with Johnson instead was because you look at 147 targets last year compared to 84.
Yes.
The usage is almost doubled. And so I think just the pure impact on the game, whether we like it or not. And again, this is not
we don't want it to be this way.
It's not our choice that we want Johnson to double George Pickens in targets. I think if I could just take one player moving forward, it's Pickens, obviously.
Yes.
Even just after 1 year, because I think that at least he offers the upside. He was extremely consistent at the catch point, and he was far more efficient. But because the market share is so heavy for this receiver, like I said, top 8 in the NFL, all three of the last 3 seasons, so much of the team's offensive success is going to depend on how he does. And that's why he has to be better in the red zone. He has to be better after the catch. And if he does take a step back to where he was in 2021, I think that you could argue that he's the more valuable player at Pickens at that point, because he's going to be the guy that's getting 9 to 11 looks a game, and Pickens will be getting 4 to 7. And so you hope that the paradigm shift happens a little bit greater than that, obviously, because I think that Pickens is a lot closer to Deontay. It shouldn't be one doubling the receiver in targets than the other. But I do think, unfortunately, he does have a big hand in this team's success. And so we'll see how that plays out. Number 3 on the list, Shayne. And so these 3, I think most would agree would be the consensus top 3 coming here. Number 3, I have Cameron Heyward. Even in his old age, it's so hard to count this guy out. And eventually, Shayne, we know that Heyward is going to fall off. But I just feel like he's going to be that Calais Campbell type player where you can play strong until like 37, 38 years old. And maybe he can walk away on his time. That the fall off could happen this year. We don't know, because anytime you get to this point, you're kind of operating on borrowed time. Heyward is towards the end of his NFL career, but he's still coming off an all pro caliber season, and one that he could have had those accolades again last year. He's just a good football player, and he's not only good, he might be the most consistent player on the team. He just, in terms of taking on double teams, getting pressure on the quarterback, the most consistent run defender. And the reason I have him 3rd in terms of the team's success is, even though I think the wide receiver position on a whole is more important than an interior defensive lineman, what Heyward offers as an all-around football player is spectacular. And if you lose this guy, you don't have a Stephon Tuitt anymore to fall back on. I mean, Steelers would be in real trouble. They've already been a bad team in the past at times when it comes to defending the run. And if you are forced to miss Heyward being on the field for any amount of time, that's really going to hurt your defense a lot.
Yeah, I think for me at this point, he's as important as he's ever been, because even though the interior defensive line is improved from last year, you bring Ogunjobi back, you bring in Keanu Benson, who I do think is going to be an impact in year 1. DeMarvin Leal's a year older, and you hope that his role is more solidified. You have guys there that you hope can elevate themselves past what the group could do last year. But it's still, if he gets hurt, this becomes very quickly one of the weaker interior defensive lines, especially in the AFC and across the league, really. Just because of the fact you have one guy who has a proven track record, and that's about it. And that's not where you want to be in a division that can run the football the way that they can. And really in the AFC can run the football the way that they can. As much as it's become a passing conference with all the great quarterbacks, if a team can run on you, they're going to do that. It's just easier and more effective if you can run the ball that's down somebody's throat. So for me, if Cam doesn't play like he has the past really 5, 6, 7 years, that could open up this run defense, especially because I think the pass rush will be in good shape as long as the edge rushers stay healthy. But if Cam can't help with the interior run defense, it could get ugly really fast. We don't have a lot of true run defenders in this group, really. So if he can't maintain the point of attack like he's done for us for several years, like you said, that's going to really be an issue for this team, especially with new linebackers trying to get acclimated as well.
Yeah, and like I said, Shayne, there are positions that are more important than this, but this is it. I mean, you have quarterback, edge, wide receiver, offensive tackle, and I didn't have an offensive tackle making this list. Spoiler alert, because Cam is just so much better than the offensive tackles the Steelers have right now. And so I think that his impact, if the Steelers were to go from, if Broderick Jones got hurt and you went back to Dan Moore, that's not nearly as big of a loss to their football team for this particular season as it would be losing Cam Heyward and then shuffling a rotation of guys through there, because the gap between Heyward and the next best guy is so sizable right now. And again, you're talking about over the last 4 years or so, Shayne. I think that really, if you're looking at that size as a collection, I think he's second only to Aaron Donald in that span, in terms of his overall play, his consistency, in terms of all interior defenders. Obviously, a little bit different roles there, but the guy is just so valuable, and so he's not a player you want to lose. Fortunately, knock on wood, been very healthy.
Yes,
over the years. He had a pec tear of his own a while back now. That was earlier in his career, but he's been very healthy, and so we hope that he can stay that way. The Steelers are absolutely going to need him if they want to have a shot at making a run here in 2023. Number 2 on the list, I've got the great TJ Watt, Defensive Player of the Year in 2021. Watt has been so banged up these last 2 years, and it makes me sad because the pace was just so remarkable.
Yeah.
And now in having the pec tear last year, only recording 5.5 sacks, even with that, Shayne, even with missing nearly half of a season and getting a setback the way that he did last year, he's still third in terms of sack production over his first 6 years in NFL history. Reggie White, DeMarcus Ware, TJ Watt. That's your list right there. And he could be right up there in terms of personal accolades with the best of them had he not had that injury last year. Even if you go back to 2021, Shayne, the impact was still felt. He was still a playmaker, wasn't as consistent and didn't quite get the same pressure rate as he did in 19 and 20 because he was dealing with a hip, knee, and groin injury. They were kind of ongoing injuries. They flared back up at points in the season. He missed 2 full games. He exited the contest early in 2 or 3 others. And so even in his defensive player of the year season, Shayne, he was still banged up. So you can imagine if this guy gets back to full health right here, prime of his career, 28 years old, he is going to be a difference maker. And we know that. And we know we've seen enough of TJ Watt to know that if this guy is healthy, and I made a point in the past, Shayne, that the Steelers quarterback situation, because it was faltering with Ben, and you look at like early last year, you might argue that TJ Watt could be number 1 on your list. And typically you would never say a quarterback is always the most important. TJ Watt was so valuable to what he offered the team. And you can see that by almost every metric. The Steelers were on pace to be the 4th worst sack team in NFL history, according to StatHead, when TJ Watt was absent from the lineup during his stint on IR. When he comes back, it's just a totally different ballgame. Alex Highsmith gets 11 of his 14.5 sacks with TJ Watt in the lineup. Hayward gets more of his with Watt. The team gets a better pressure rate, and he just offers something to the entire team that nobody else on this team can do. And he's, in terms of who he is, I mean, he is just a better player than everybody else. He's a more impactful player than everybody else when he is healthy. Quarterback is the most important position. TJ Watt is really good. How is he in the right spot, Shayne? Would you have him second in your rankings?
I think because of, again, the fact that the quarterback is so important, you kind of have to put him at 2 and no higher. I think that you could argue last year when Trubisky was asked to start the season and you had rookie Kenny Pickett in there, you could argue, like you said last year, that he probably was the most important player to this team in terms of winning. As crazy as that is for most teams for that to be the case, it kind of was, because this offense was designed to kind of limit the quarterback's ability to really mess anything up per se. And also it limits their ability to help as well. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. Because of that, I think last year when TJ was out, you saw that as much as Kenny really improved down the stretch, and that was a big reason why they finished the season 7-2. Another big reason is TJ Watt was playing in those games. So that's kind of what it comes down to. It works out that way. Yeah.
It really is, Shayne. And it seems like a bizarre thought. Like almost always, you're going to pick the quarterback. But it was the gap between Pickett as a rookie and Trubisky big enough to say, I would rather have either of these 2 quarterbacks, or would I rather have TJ Watt playing? I think that there's enough evidence that we're gathering now. I mean, Watt has missed a good chunk of time. He's missed 11 games, and the Steelers are 1-10 without him. And it's not like they've just played all-star teams,
right? Like
and
all
playoff teams. Here, I've got it right in front of me here because I broke this down a little bit ago, Shayne. These are the quarterbacks that the Steelers have lost to over TJ Watt's career when he does not play. Mike Glennon, Baker Mayfield. You get a couple good ones in there. Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert, and Josh Allen. And then he's lost to Mac Jones, Jacoby Brissett, Zach Wilson, Tua Tagovailoa, and Jalen Hurts, who's good. So, I mean, there's a lot of bad quarterbacks and bad teams mixed in here, and the Steelers do not take care of business in these games when Watt doesn't play. And so I think there's enough evidence now. And not only that, but the Steelers sack rate is almost 3 times higher when TJ Watt is playing football. And so I don't think any of these things are coincidences at this point. But that does lead us to our number 1 player, and that is quarterback Kenny Pickett. I assume that Pickett is going to take a jump this year, and your quarterback should be, Shayne, the most valuable player on your team. I think that will be the case with Pickett this year. I think that because of the jump that I expect him to take from year 1 to year 2, now you're going to be at the point, Shayne, where you're going to say, yeah, I would rather have Pickett than TJ Watt if I could only choose one guy, because going back to Trubisky would be devastating at this point. You want that to be the case with Pickett, where you can say, yes, he's at least a mid-level starting quarterback, and a mid-level starting quarterback is important to a team. And so I expect him to take that leap. Obviously, he's got a lot of work to do in terms of improving his yards per attempt. He was near the bottom of the league in terms of yard per attempt, adjusted yards per attempt. I think those numbers will go up. I think he will improve with time. And we saw him down the stretch. I mean, this is a quarterback, even though the game plan was pretty blah and included a lot of running and the schedule wasn't great down the stretch in terms of difficulty. Pickett was 6-1 in his last 7 games with the Steelers. And again, that's excluding the game where he threw 1 pass against the Ravens and exited the contest in the first quarter. 6-1 down the stretch. He had 4 game-winning drives last year, which tied Ben Roethlisberger's season high. And he had 2 of them that came in big moments against the Ravens, and the Raiders game was the Christmas Eve game. And so you see some of the signs that you like from him. He plays inarguably the most important position in football. He's entering his 2nd year, which historically is the year we've seen the biggest jump for quarterback play. And so there's plenty of evidence to suggest that, and not only that, Shayne, but the Steelers have kind of revamped the offensive line around him. Pickens is another year improved, hopefully. And so you add Allen Robinson, you add Calvin Austin, Pat Freiermuth, again, he's ascending. And so you assume that Pickett is going to take that leap. Do you think that it's right to have him at the top of this list?
Like I said, I think you have to with any team, pretty much. I think the only team you can make an argument for their quarterback not being their most important player is San Francisco. That's because it doesn't seem to matter who their quarterback is. They get relatively the same results, and that's more about the offense than anything else.
Yes.
But with Kenny, I think the question that we all have, or that we all should have, is he going to ascend to the point where the offense itself transcends what he could do last year? Or is he simply, and this is the kind of the concern, but not necessarily the end of the world, does he just run the offense that happened last year as good as it can be run? That's, I think, the question. Because if all he ends up doing is running the offense that was called last year for the most part, just much better because he's older and he's got more experience in it, you're going to see a jump, just maybe not as big of a one as you hope. But the question for me is Matt Canada and the rest of the Steelers brass going to allow him to transcend the offense that's being called? Is he going to be allowed or encouraged to, okay, we're calling this play, but if you don't see it, make something happen. Look for George down the field. Look for Deontay down the field. Get a first down, running like he was able to do last year. If they give him that autonomy to say, okay, we know what we're trying to accomplish on offense, but if it's not there or it's not going to get us where we need to go, now it's on me. Let me go make a play. That has to be, in my opinion, what they do. Because if they don't give him that ability, or they don't instill that confidence in him to say, okay, we want you to do this if it's available to you. Look at some of the games at the end of last year. The touchdown to Najee against the Ravens to win the game, where he breaks out of the sack, turns around and throws down the field to him. Stuff like that. That's the type of stuff that has to happen more consistently, whether we want it to or not. I'd love the offense to just be better called, but we have the same offensive coordinator, so I can't assume that's going to happen. It comes down to what Kenny's able to do on his own with this receiving core and with an offensive line that should give him the ability to do more of those off-script things without having to break out of a sack or to necessarily have to run away per se of guys, but just find open space and get the ball down the field. If he can do that, not only is he the most important player because he's going to be anyway, it could mean that the Steelers offense can actually be the reason they win games occasionally and not just enough to get it done when the defense shows up. That's the key for this year coming up.
Yeah, and it's a fine line, and it's hard to find that balance because I know that the Steelers' game plan is going to be run the ball, take good care of the football, play good defense. At the same time, you don't want to hamstring him. But you can't ask him to go out there and be Patrick Mahomes either, where you're just slinging the ball 45 times a game and you're just going to make enough things happen without bad things happening either. And so I think that it's finding the balance between the two. I want him to be closer to Tony Romo than I do to Andy Dalton. At the end of the day, I mean, that's what you want is the guy. And I throw those two examples out there because I feel like his play style is a little bit Romo-esque. And I think you kind of see some of that with the way that he moves around, his feel for the pocket, his ability to kind of extend the play, keep his eyes down the field. And that's a good thing. And so I want to see those type of traits continue to grow. I wanted to see him make those plays more consistently. And I want to see Matt Canada loosen the leash on his collar a little bit there to say, yeah, go out there and make a play for us. Go out there and do your thing. And so have it more like it was during his Pitt days with Mark Whipple, where he can say, yeah, you can go out there and I trust you that you are going to extend the play. And I don't care if you hold the ball for 3, 4, 5 seconds at times. If you're going to find players down the field, that's what we want. And so the Steelers need to be willing to do that at the risk of taking some sacks and at the risk of potentially throwing a few more interceptions throughout the season. Because to me, if you're scoring 18.1 points per game like they did last year, and you're taking care of the ball, then what's the purpose? Like
it doesn't matter.
No, and even if you weasel your way into the playoffs with 9 or 10 wins as a wild card seed, and you're not scoring points, how can you expect to do it in crunch time when you're going to be going against the best the AFC has to offer and some of the best quarterbacks? Is a strong quarterback conference. I mean, you might get stacked up against Justin Herbert, Joe Burrow, Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, whoever. Any combination of quarterbacks you play in the AFC is going to be tough. So you have to be able to find a way to outscore these guys, to put points on the board. Regardless of how the Steelers decide to do this, Shayne, I do think that Pickett will be the most valuable player on the Steelers this year because so much of the team's success depends on him now. You can have a great draft. You can have a healthy TJ Watt. You can have all these things working towards you now. You can have an improved offensive line and just be a better roster across the board. If your quarterback doesn't take that jump, you're not going to be where you need to be. This is a huge year for Kenny Pickett. I don't think that he's on his last legs or anything that way, but it is a big year in terms of his progression, his development. And I think it's going to be very telling, Shayne, the type of quarterback that we are going to see moving forward based on kind of what he does this year. Is he going to show us enough where he can jump up to like a tier 2, tier 3 quarterback? Can he be a potential top 10 quarterback, Shayne, in the NFL? Are we truly looking at a guy that's just going to be that game manager, mid-level starter on a good day? And so we're hoping that it's the former, obviously. And so we'll have to see what we get from him. Any other thoughts on this list, Shayne, that you want to share?
The only thing I wanted to mention again with Kenny, and this is just kind of a reason to kind of go with what I said before about it's going to come down to them allowing him to do more of this. The best this offense looked all year was in the moments whenever they didn't have a choice but to let Kenny rip the football in the middle of the field and down the field. And I think that there's clearly a reason for that, because whenever he was given the ability, when he knew like, okay, this is on me now, he showed up whenever he was given that opportunity. You look at the Raiders game to go win that game. You look again at the Ravens game, the drive to get down there. I think of the throw to Steven Sims where there's nowhere to get that football and somehow he still gets it in there. Like that's the type of stuff that if they give him the ability to do, he's already shown it in spurts as a rookie. There's no reason for me to believe that's suddenly going to go away or that he can't do that. So if the Steelers, if we look at this offense and it's week 5 and it's the same thing as last year, then one, that just tells me more and more that Matt Canada should not have been retained even this year just to finish out his contract. And 2, the Steelers are too afraid of their own failure on offense, possible failure, than they are to be excited about him as a player and allow him to be the guy that he should be. So I just hope for his sake and for the Steelers' sake that they understand who they're dealing with here, because regardless of your feelings about Pickett, he clearly he can't play the way he was asked to play last year and ever be more than a mid-level starter. He has to be given the leash to go out there and throw the football around a little bit, especially whenever the offense isn't working. Like you have to open things up whenever that's happening, and I just hope that they're willing to do it.
Yeah, and Kenny Pickett clearly has confidence. We hope that the coaching staff has the same level of confidence in him that he has.
They say they
in
do.
Himself.
So they got to show it. They got to show it.
We will find that out this year. So again, my rankings one more time. I have Kenny Pickett as my most valuable player in terms of success for this team in 2023. I have TJ Watt number 2, Cameron Hayward number 3, Deontay Johnson number 4 because of the volume that goes through him in that offense, and Minkah Fitzpatrick number 5. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you guys have anything you want to share, please drop them in the comment section here on YouTube. And thank you all for joining us on the Steel Curtain podcast today. You can follow Shayne on Twitter at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on Twitter at Tommy Jaggi. You can download the Steel Curtain podcast wherever you get your podcast. Also check us out on YouTube or ask Alexa to play the Steel Curtain podcast. And thanks for listening to the Steel Curtain podcast.